Clara Whitfield did not weep at her husband's grave. She stood straight, jaw-set, hands folded over her worn black dress, and let every eye in Willow Falls watch her grieve without flinching. She had survived worse than their pity. She had survived their contempt. A round woman in a town that measured worth by waistlines and wedding rings. She had learned long ago that tears were currency she could not afford to spend in public. What she had not survived yet, what none of them knew was coming, was the cruelty waiting for her at the next town meeting. Before we go any further, if this story already has your heart, please subscribe to this channel and follow Clara's journey all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The meeting was held on a Tuesday, which Clara always thought was the cruelest kind of day for bad news. Not a Monday when a person still had their defenses up. Not a Friday when the week had beaten you down enough that nothing surprised you anymore. A Tuesday, when you just started to believe the week might be ordinary. She arrived early because she was always early. Punctuality was one of the few things nobody in Willow Falls could take from her. She smoothed her dress, squared her shoulders, and took her usual seat near the back of the meeting house, where the lantern light didn't quite reach her face, and she could watch the room without being watched too closely in return. The meeting house was already half full when Mayor Gerald Holt walked in, and Clara knew immediately from the way he carried himself, that particular brand of puffed-up self-importance she'd learned to recognize in men who enjoyed delivering news. They'd already decided that this meeting was not going to be ordinary. "Folks," Gerald said, spreading his hands wide, like a preacher opening a sermon. "As y'all know, Widow Whitfield here has been managing the old Whitfield property since poor Thomas passed on 6 months back." Clara felt the eyes before she saw them. 20-30 people turning to look at her with that particular mixture of sympathy and satisfaction that small towns reserved for their most convenient tragedies. "And as y'all also know," Gerald continued, his voice dropping into what he probably thought was a tone of genuine concern, "the bank has been patient. More patient than most would say they're obliged to be. 3 months behind on payment," said Raymond Alcott from the front row, not even bothering to lower his voice. Raymond owned the dry goods store and had been looking at the Whitfield land with hungry eyes since before Thomas was cold in the ground. "That's not patience, that's charity." "It is what it is," Gerald agreed, which was his way of agreeing with Raymond without appearing to. He cleared his throat. "Now the county has a proposal. A solution, you might say, that benefits everyone involved." Clara's hands tightened in her lap. She did not move. She had learned that stillness was armor. "There's a man," Gerald said. "Name of Eli Rourke. Mountain man trapper, been living up in the northern ridge near Coldwater Pass for the better part of 10 years. He came down last spring with a back injury. Horse fell on him, from what I understand. He's been staying at the Morrison boarding house, but Doris Morrison says she can't keep him on indefinitely, and the county can't keep paying his board. He's got nobody, no family, no property, no income." The room was very quiet. Clara heard it before she understood it. That particular quality of silence that precedes something mean. "We thought," Gerald said, and now she could hear the amusement sitting just underneath his measured tone, carefully controlled, but present the way. A smirk is present even when a man keeps his face straight, that a widow who needs help running her property and a man who needs a roof and a purpose, well, that might be a natural fit. Someone in the back laughed. Just one person quickly stifled, but it was enough. "You want to give me a crippled man," Clara said. Her voice was flat, not a question. Gerald blinked. He had not expected her to say it out loud like that, so plainly, with no performance of shock or hurt. "Now, Clara, that's not quite the way I'd—" "That is exactly the way you'd put it, Gerald, if you were being honest." She looked at Raymond Alcott. "Is this your idea?" Raymond had the decency to look mildly uncomfortable, which was approximately all the decency he possessed. "It's a practical solution to 2 practical problems." "Practical?" She let the words sit in the air. "You're going to hand me a man I've never met, who can't work, in exchange for what exactly? What does the county offer in return for me taking on this burden?" 3 months extension on the bank payment, Gerald said. "And we'll arrange for Doc Hadley to come out to the property twice a month to see to Rourke's care at county expense." The room waited. She could feel them waiting. some with genuine curiosity. Most she knew because she had spent 41 years learning to read rooms like this one, waiting for her to protest, to cry, to make some display of helpless feminine distress that would entertain them for the next 6 weeks of supper conversation. Clara Whitfield stood up. She was not a small woman. She had never been a small woman, and she had spent most of her life being made to feel that this was the primary relevant fact about her existence. In Willow Falls, she was not Clara, who kept the cleanest kitchen in 3 counties, or Clara, who had nursed Thomas through 4 winters of illness without once asking anyone for help, or Clara, who could read and write better than half the men in this room. She was Clara, who was large. Clara, who was heavy. Clara, who wore the largest dresses the seamstress stocked and still needed them let out. She was aware of all of that as she stood. She was aware of what they saw when they looked at her. She squared her shoulders anyway. "Fine," she said. "I'll take him." The room erupted not in applause, not in protest, but in that low buzzing murmur that meant people were already reshaping what they'd just witnessed into the version they'd tell later. She heard fragments as she gathered her shawl. "Didn't even negotiate. Guess she's desperate. Poor thing. At least she'll have company." Imagine those two. She did not stay to hear the rest. The boarding house was at the north end of Main Street, a narrow 2-story building that leaned slightly to the left, as if it had been tired for a long time, and nobody had noticed. Doris Morrison answered the door with flour on her hands and relief on her face that she tried and failed to disguise as courtesy. "Mrs. Whitfield, I heard you might be coming by." "News travels," Clara said. "It does in this town." Doris stepped back to let her in. "He's upstairs, 2nd door on the right. I'll warn you he's not in what you'd call a welcoming mood." "I don't need him to be welcoming," Clara said. "I need him to be capable of getting himself into a wagon." Doris pressed her lips together in a way that suggested this was going to be more complicated than Clara had made it sound. She was right. She heard him before she saw him. "I told Morrison I don't want visitors." The voice came through the door, low, rough-edged, the kind of voice that had spent years outdoors and hadn't softened any for it. Clara stopped with her hand raised to knock on a door she hadn't knocked on yet. "I'm not a visitor," she said through the wood. "I'm Clara Whitfield. The county has arranged for you to come and stay at my property." A pause. "The county can go to hell." She lowered her hand. She had not actually expected this to be easy, but she had hoped to at least get through the door before the resistance started. "Mr. Rourke," she said with the specific patience of a woman who has had to be patient her entire life and has therefore developed more of it than anyone should reasonably need. "I understand you didn't ask for this arrangement. I didn't ask for it either. I'm here because the alternative is that you stay in that room until Doris Morrison's patience runs out, which from the look on her face when she answered the door is approximately 3 days away. And my alternative is losing my property to Raymond Alcott, who is the sort of man who smiles at your face and steals from your pocket." Another pause, longer this time. "Open the door," the voice said. "I want to see who they sent." She turned the handle and walked in. Eli Rourke was not what she had expected. She wasn't sure afterward what she had expected. The town had called him a burden, a cripple, a man past usefulness. She had constructed some vague image from those words, diminished, hollowed out, already halfway gone. The man sitting upright against the headboard of the narrow bed was none of those things. How was large? Not in the soft way she was large in the way that mountains are large, the way that things built for weather and pressure and endurance are large. Broad through the chest and shoulders, with forearms resting on his knees that looked like they'd been carved from something older and harder than ordinary men were made of. His hair was dark and longer than fashion allowed, and his jaw carried several days of beard, and his eyes were the color of river water in autumn. Dark amber, clear and still, and they moved over her with the slow, deliberate assessment that had nothing in it of the cruelty she was used to. He was looking at her the way she sometimes looked at a problem, trying to understand it. "You're the widow," he said. "Yes." "How old are you?" "That," she said, "is not your business, Mr. Rourke." "I'm 37, he offered, as if this evened some score. I'm 41. She looked at the way he held himself, the careful, controlled stillness of a man managing pain he wasn't going to mention. What exactly did the horse do to your back? Something shifted in his face. Not softness, not yet. More like the recalibration of a man who had expected a different kind of conversation. Compression injury. 3 vertebrae. Doc Hadley says I'll walk again eventually. Says I need time and rest and not to overwork myself. His mouth tightened. I'm not built for rest. No, Clara said. I don't imagine you are. She looked around the small room at the single window and the boots lined up neatly against the wall and the complete absence of any personal effects that might suggest a life outside these 4 walls. Can you get yourself into a wagon? If I have to. You have to. He looked at her for a long moment. They told me about you. I'm sure they did. They said you were... He stopped. Fat, she said evenly. They said I was fat, and that you should be grateful anyone would have you at all, and that it was all very funny. She met his eyes. Is any of that going to be a problem for you, Mr. Rourke? Eli Rourke was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then he said, I've been laughed at plenty in the last 8 months, Mrs. Whitfield. I'm not much interested in doing it to somebody else. It was not warmth. It was not a promise. It was something more reliable than either. It was a statement of position from a man who appeared to say what he meant. Good, she said. We leave in an hour. Word had gotten around because word always got around in Willow Falls, and by the time Clara guided the wagon back down Main Street with Eli Rourke sitting stiff and silent beside her, there were people watching from the sidewalks. She kept her eyes on the road. Eli kept his eyes on the road. But she heard them. Of course she heard them. A town this size in a street this narrow, voices carried whether you wanted them to or not. Lord, look at the 2 of them. The widow and the cripple. There's a pair. Reckon she'll have to do all the work herself. Reckon she's used to that. Laughter. The light, careless kind that people produce when they've decided someone else's circumstances are entertainment. She felt Eli shift beside her. A small movement, but deliberate. Keep going, he said quietly. Not to her, almost to himself, like a man reminding himself of something. I wasn't planning to stop, she said. She felt, rather than saw him look at her. Then he faced forward again, and they drove out of town without speaking another word, and the laughter faded behind them like weather passing. The Whitfield property was 3 miles outside town, at the end of a rutted track that ran alongside a dry creek bed before opening up into a yard that had been once a real working farm. It was not that now. The barn needed new boards along the south wall. The kitchen garden had gone mostly to weeds. The fence line along the eastern pasture had a section down that had been down so long the grass had grown up through the broken rails. Thomas had been sick for 2 years before he died. Clara had managed. She had managed more than anyone knew, and less well than she had hoped, and the gap between those 2 things was the thing the bank kept sending letters about. She brought the wagon to a stop in the yard and set the brake. Eli looked at the property the way she imagined he looked at terrain, reading it, calculating it, filing information away behind those amber eyes. The barn, he said. South wall. I know. Fence line east is down. I know. The well housing looks... I know everything that's wrong with it, Mr. Rourke, she said with a patience that had developed a slight edge. I've been looking at it for 6 months. What I haven't had is another pair of hands. He was quiet for a moment. Then, help me down. Are you certain you can... Help me down, Mrs. Whitfield. She climbed out first and came around to his side. He was already moving carefully controlled the way a man moves when he knows exactly where his limits are and is going to push right up against them without going over. She put a hand under his arm, and he accepted it without comment, and between them, they got him to the ground where he stood with one hand braced on the wagon side and took a slow breath. The barn, he said again. It can wait until you've rested. Show me the barn. She showed him the barn. He walked the length of it slowly, one hand occasionally touching the wall for balance, his eyes moving over every board and crossbeam with an attention that reminded her of the way Thomas had never looked at anything on this property in his entire life. He stopped at the section of the south wall that had warped outward from winter moisture, pressed his hand flat against the wood, and pushed slightly to test the give. "That'll come down in a hard wind," he said. "Yes." "You have spare lumber?" "Some. Back of the barn." He turned to look at her. "I can't do heavy lifting, not yet. But I can tell you what needs doing and in what order, and I can do finish work. Hammering, fitting, joinery. The lifting. Do you have anyone who could come for day work?" "Jesse Birch," she said. "He's 15 and strong and will work for fair wages." "Get him for 3 days." He looked back at the wall. "We can get that secured before the next storm comes through." Clara studied the side of his face. She had spent the last several hours preparing herself for resentment, for a man who would feel humiliated by his circumstances and take that humiliation out on whoever was nearest. She had met that kind before. She had been married to a version of it, though she had never said so out loud, and did not plan to start now. This man was something different. "Why does it matter to you?" she asked. "You've been here 20 minutes. He turned to look at her. "Because it matters to you," he said. "And because I'm going to be living here. And because a barn that comes down in a storm can kill a man." He paused. "And because I'm not built for sitting still, Mrs. Whitfield. If I have to be here, I'd rather be useful than not." She looked at him for a moment. "The room off the kitchen," she said. "It's small, but it's warm and it's private." "That'll do. Supper is at 6. I don't wait. I'll be there." I was there at 5:53. He came to the table, slowly lowering himself into the chair with that same controlled care she had noticed in the boarding house, and he sat with his back straight in the posture of a man who had learned that slouching cost him more than it saved. He looked at the food she had put out: beans, salt pork, cornbread, preserved peaches from last summer, and something moved across his face too quickly for her to name. "This is more than I've had at one sitting in some time," he said. "I cook what I cook," she said. "You'll eat what's here." I wasn't complaining. He picked up his fork. I was noting. They ate in silence for a while. Outside, the evening was settling in, and the wind had come up slightly from the north. Clara listened to it and thought about the south wall of the barn and whether Jesse Birch's mother would allow him to come for day work. "How long has the fence been down?" Eli asked. "Since January." "And the well housing?" "Last autumn." He chewed, looking at the table. "What did you do all winter?" "What I always do," she said. "I managed." He looked at her then, a direct, unhurried look that she found she didn't particularly want to flinch away from, which was unusual. "That must have been very lonely," he said. The word landed differently than she expected. Not with pity, just accurately. The way a man might note that a fence was down, a thing that was true and worth noting. "I've been lonely most of my life," she said, before she'd decided to say it. He nodded slowly. "So have I." The wind pressed at the window. The lantern light moved slightly. "My wife left," he said after a moment. 7 years ago. She said the mountain was no place for a family, and she wasn't wrong. But she also said—" He stopped, started again. "She said she'd married a man she thought would amount to something, and that she'd been mistaken." His jaw tightened just briefly. "I went further up the mountain after that, stayed there." Clara looked at her plate. "People say things in anger that they believe." "Yes," he said. "They do. That doesn't make them right." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "No, it doesn't." 3 weeks and Jesse Birch came for his 3 days of work, and between Jesse's back and Eli's direction, the south wall of the barn was secured by the end of the second day. Clara watched from the yard while she hung laundry, and she noticed the way Eli moved around Jesse, never raising his voice, always clear, giving the boy the specific kind of instruction that made a young person feel capable rather than corrected. Jesse came to her on the third evening before he left, and said with the slightly odd expression of a 15-year-old who has encountered something he doesn't have words for, that Mr. Rourke sure knows about building things. "He knows about a lot of things," Clara said. "Is he staying on?" "He is." Jesse nodded, turning his hat in his hands. "Good," he said. "The place looks better already." She looked at the barn. It did look better. It looked for the first time since Thomas got sick like a place someone was paying attention to. She thought about what Eli had said at supper that first night. Because it matters to you. She turned back to her laundry and kept her thoughts to herself. On a Wednesday, 32 days after Eli Rourke moved into the room off the kitchen, Raymond Alcott drove up the track in his fine black buggy. Clara was in the kitchen garden. Eli was on the porch doing what he could do from the porch, repairing harness leather, a task that required hands and attention, but not a working back. He looked up when the buggy came into the yard. He didn't move. Raymond climbed down and looked around the property with the proprietorial interest of a man who has already decided something belongs to him. "Clara," he said when she straightened up from the garden, "things are looking better out here." "They are," she said. His eyes moved to Eli on the porch. "Rourke." Eli looked at him. "Alcott." The flatness of those two syllables was something Clara filed away. Raymond looked back at her. "I wanted to talk to you about the east pasture. I know you've been having trouble keeping up the property, and I've been thinking if you ever wanted to sell that section, it would take some pressure off your payments." "The east pasture runs to the creek," Clara said. "It does. The creek is where my cattle water." "Well, now we could work something out about water rights." "Raymond." She set down her garden tool. "That pasture is not for sale." He smiled. It was a patient smile, the smile of a man who believes that patience is a form of eventual victory. "Times are hard, Clara. I'm just saying if things get difficult." "If things get difficult, I'll handle them." She looked at him steadily. "I always have." Raymond's eyes went to Eli again. Something moved in them, calculation, or its cousin. "That man able to work?" he asked as if Eli weren't present. Eli set down the harness leather. Raymond must have noticed something in that small motion, because he took a half-step back toward his buggy without quite meaning to. "I can work," Eli said in a voice that carried across the yard like a door closing. "Well enough." Raymond looked between them. Then he nodded with the nodding of a man who has not lost, but is choosing to defer. "Well," he said, "good to see the place coming along." He climbed back into his buggy. "I'll check in again sometime." "Don't trouble yourself," Clara said pleasantly. They watched the buggy go. After a moment, Eli said, "He wants the water. He's wanted it for years. He'll come back." "I know." She picked up her garden tool. "That's what men like Raymond do. They come back." She went back to the garden. After a moment, she heard Eli pick up the harness leather again. That night, she was sitting at the kitchen table, going over the account book, when she heard him in the hallway. The careful, slightly uneven gait that was getting steadier by the week, but still announced him before he arrived. He appeared in the kitchen doorway and looked at her. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you." "I don't sleep well." "Neither do I." She looked up at him. "What is it?" He leaned against the doorframe. "He'll use the bank," he said. "When he comes back, it won't be with an offer. It'll be with leverage. A man like that, he doesn't buy what he wants. He engineers it." She had known this already in the practical, unromantic part of her mind that had been managing crisis since Thomas's first bad winter. But hearing it stated plainly without softening felt like something different. It felt like being taken seriously. "I know," she said. "The payment that's due next month." "I'm short," she said. $18 short. I've been running figures for a week." He was quiet. She waited for what men usually said in these moments, the uncomfortable suggestion that she find a way, the retreat behind the fiction that the problem would solve itself. "I have $63, Eli said. "In the strongbox in my room. It's everything I had when I came down off the mountain." She looked at him. "I'm not taking your money, Mr. Rourke." "It's not charity," he said. "I'm living on this property. I'm eating your food. I'm sleeping in your room. The way I see it, room and board has a fair rate, and you haven't charged me a cent of it." He met her eyes. $63 covers about 8 months at a fair rate. She opened her mouth. "And before you say anything," he added with a quietness that had some dry thing under it that she was beginning to recognize as his version of humor, Yes, I'm aware that I'm the one who came here with no means and no options, and that this is not a negotiation. You have the leverage to win. So you might as well accept it as a business arrangement and save us both the argument. Clara Whitfield looked at this man. This difficult, careful, direct man who had arrived in her yard 32 days ago as a joke, and who had not in 32 days given her a single reason to treat him like one. Fine, she said. As a business arrangement. Good. We'll keep the accounts properly. I wouldn't have it any other way. She looked back at her ledger. After a moment, she heard him push off the doorframe. Mrs. Whitfield. Yes, you're going to keep this property, he said. I want you to know I believe that. She didn't look up, but something shifted quietly in her chest, like a door she hadn't known was closed, moving very slightly on its hinges. Good night, Mr. Rourke, she said. Good night, Mrs. Whitfield. His footsteps moved back down the hall. She listened until she heard the door of the room off the kitchen close. Then she turned back to her figures, and for the first time in 6 months, she did not feel entirely alone in the solving of them. The $63 bought them time. Not much, but enough. Clara made the payment on a Thursday morning, rode into town alone, because Eli's back wouldn't tolerate the wagon ride 2 days running, and set the money on the bank manager's desk with the specific composure of a woman who has rehearsed appearing unbothered until it became genuine. Harold Finch counted it twice, which was his habit, and also his way of making people feel the weight of what they owed. And then he stamped the ledger and slid it back across the desk without meeting her eyes. You're current through July, he said. I'm aware of what I'm current through, Harold. August payment will be due the 1st. I know when August is. She rode home with the receipt folded in her pocket and her hands steady on the reins, and she didn't let herself feel the relief until she turned off the main road onto the track and the town was behind her and there was nobody watching anymore. Then she exhaled. Long and slow, the way you breathe out something you've been holding for longer than one morning. Eli was standing at the fence line when she came into the yard. Not the east pasture, the small paddock fence, the one nearest the house. He had a board balanced against the rail and was working a nail into it with a hammer, one-handed, his other arm braced against the post for support. The motion was careful and deliberate, and should not by any measure have been something he was doing yet. She pulled the wagon to a stop. Doc Hadley said no overhead work, she said. This isn't overhead. He said limited strain on the lower back. I know what he said. He drove the nail flush with 3 clean strikes and looked at it with the satisfaction of a man who has produced a small, exact thing. He also said movement was better than stillness. I'm choosing to emphasize that part. You're choosing to emphasize the part that suits you. Most people do. He set down the hammer and turned to look at her. How did it go? We're current through July. Something moved in his face, not quite relief, because he didn't carry tension the way she did outwardly. More like a reordering, a calculation completed. Good, he said. That leaves us 6 weeks to come up with the August payment before Alcott starts circling again. She climbed down from the wagon. I've been thinking about the south pasture, if I can get 3 more head on it before midsummer. 4, he said. She looked at him. The grass won't carry 4. It will if we rotate. He moved to the wagon and began working the harness with her, taking the left side without asking, because in the past 5 weeks they had developed an unspoken division of tasks, so natural she sometimes forgot it hadn't always existed. Let me show you something after supper. He showed her after supper. He had drawn it out on a piece of paper in the afternoon, a rough map of the property's pasture sections, with rotation lines marked in pencil, noting which sections to rest and which to graze in what order. His handwriting was unexpectedly neat. She looked at it for a long time. Where did you learn this? She asked. Trial and error, he said. 12 years on a mountain with a limited amount of everything will teach you about conservation. He pointed to the north section. This one's been resting since before I got here. The grass will be heavy by July. You rotate the herd through here in late June, you free up the south section for new animals. She looked at the paper. She looked at the property she had been managing by feel and desperation for 2 years, and she saw it rendered as something someone had actually thought about, actually planned. "You could have been a rancher," she said. "I was once, briefly." His voice didn't change, but something behind it shifted. Before Sarah decided I wasn't. She didn't ask him to say more. She had learned in 5 weeks that Eli Rourke said exactly what he meant to say, and not one word more, and that the spaces he left were not invitations to fill. She looked back at the paper. "Forehead," she said. "Forehead," he agreed. She bought the cattle on a Saturday from old George Purvis, who had more stock than pasture and was willing to deal fair for cash, and she drove them back herself, with Jesse Birch riding alongside on his father's mare. Jesse had started coming around twice a week by then, not always for pay, which Clara suspected had more to do with Eli than with any particular fondness for fence repair. The boy asked. Eli questions the way. Water finds low ground constantly, naturally, without apparent awareness of doing it. How do you set a post so it doesn't heave in winter? How do you read a horse's gait to know if it's favoring? What do you do when a well goes alkaline? And Eli answered everyone with the same unhurried specificity, as if a 15-year-old's education in practical things was a project worth taking seriously. Clara watched this from a distance and thought about what kind of man bothers to teach a boy things that are useful, the kind who was never taught them young enough himself usually. She didn't say that to Eli. Some observations were better kept. They got the new cattle into the south pasture by mid-afternoon and stood at the fence watching them settle, and Jesse was thrilled in the way young people are thrilled by tangible outcomes. Things visibly accomplished, problems visibly moved closer to solved. "That's 4 more, Jesse said with the authority of someone who has learned to count assets. "You're going to be all right, Mrs. Whitfield." "I intend to be," she said. Jesse looked at Eli. "Mr. Rourke, do you think—" "Go home, Jesse," Eli said, but not unkindly. "Your mother'll want you for supper." Jesse went ning, and they stood at the fence in the evening quiet, with the cattle moving slow in the grass below them, and Clara was aware of Eli beside her in the way she had started to be aware of him everywhere, as a presence with specific weight and temperature and sound, a presence she had learned to read without meaning to. "He's a good boy," she said. "Hi is." A pause. "He reminds me of myself at that age. Before I decided the best thing I could do was disappear into the wilderness and let the world get on without me." She looked at him. It was the most he had said about himself in 5 weeks. "What made you decide that—" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. "My father," he finally said, "was a man who believed that if you couldn't do a thing perfectly, there was no point attempting it at all. He applied this to farming, to business, to his children." The muscle in his jaw moved. "When I was 18, I made a significant financial error. Lost money that should have been the family's land payment. I didn't do it through carelessness. I did it through trust, trusted the wrong man. But my father didn't distinguish between the two." He looked at the cattle. "He told me in front of my brothers that I was the sort of man who made other people's lives harder. That some men were burdens and some were foundations, and I had demonstrated which kind I was." Clara was very still. "I left 2 days later," Eli said. "Went north. Found that solitude asked less of me than people did." A pause. "That was almost 20 years ago." "And Sarah?" she asked carefully. "Sarah was 10 years after. I thought—" He stopped. "I thought I'd learned enough about myself to stop hiding. Turns out I'd just found a new kind of hiding that looked like courage." His voice had gone dry and even and remote. "She wasn't wrong that I'd failed her. She was just wrong about what the failure meant." "What did it mean?" Clara asked. He turned to look at her. "That I didn't know yet how to stay when things were hard," he said. "Not that I never could." The evening moved around them. Somewhere in the north pasture, one of the horses made a sound. "My husband," Clara said, because fair was fair, and she had asked him something true, and he had answered it, "was a kind man. He was genuinely kind, and that is not a small thing. But he was not—" She chose her words with care. "He was not a man who believed I was capable. He managed me, gently but consistently. Every decision I made was reviewed. Every idea I had was redirected. She looked at the fence post nearest her. When he got sick, everything fell to me, and I discovered that I was quite competent. At most things. And I spent a great deal of time wondering whether he had known that, and preferred I didn't, or whether he genuinely hadn't seen it. Eli was looking at her. Either way, she said, it was lonely. Yes, he said. That kind of marriage is. They stood there in the particular shared quiet of two people who have handed each other something true and are deciding what to do with what they've been given. Then Clara said, "I'm going to start supper," and turned from the fence. "I'll check the water trough," he said, and that was all. But something had shifted quietly without announcement, the way weather changes in a mountain valley. So gradually you don't know it's happened until you look up and the sky is completely different from what it was an hour ago. The hardest morning came on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of June. She found him on the kitchen floor. Not fallen. That was the first thing she assessed, dropping to her knees beside him without ceremony, her hands already moving to his shoulders. He was sitting with his back against the cabinet, and both hands flat on the floor, and his face the color of old ash, and he was breathing with the careful, controlled precision of a man choosing each breath individually. "How long have you been down here?" she said. "A while." His voice was tight, controlled. "Don't fuss." "I'm not fussing, I'm assessing. Can you move your legs?" "Yes." A pause that confirmed this was true, but uncomfortable. "I pushed it too far yesterday with the east fence. I told you the east fence could wait." "The east fence couldn't wait. Cattle get through a gap like that, we lose days rounding them up." His jaw was set. The pain was there in every muscle of his face, but he wasn't going to give it more room than that. "I just need a minute." "You need Doc Hadley." "I don't need Eli." It was the first time she had used his given name. They both noticed. "You're on my kitchen floor at 5 in the morning in considerable pain. You need Doc Hadley." He looked at her. Whatever argument he'd been assembling behind those amber eyes moved back a step. "Fine," he said. She sent Jessie for the doctor and made Eli stay on the floor until Doc Hadley arrived, because attempting the short walk from the kitchen to his room had produced an outcome that neither of them mentioned afterward. She sat on the floor across from him and drank her coffee and poured him a cup, and they waited together in silence. And she had the peculiar thought that this was one of the most honest things she had ever done with another person, just sitting with someone in their difficulty without trying to make it smaller than it was. Doc Hadley came, examined him, delivered a verdict that was stern but not catastrophic. Inflammation, overextension. Nothing structural, newly damaged, and left with specific instructions about 3 days of actual rest, which he delivered to Clara on the grounds that Eli would comply with instructions given to someone else sooner than he'd comply with instructions given to himself. "He's stubborn," Doc Hadley said at the door. "I know," Clara said. "You're going to have to watch him." "I know that too." She installed Eli in the larger chair in the sitting room, because the bed in his room was not comfortable for a man who needed to stay upright, and she moved the small table next to it with his water and his books. She'd noticed the 2 books in his room during a week when she'd been changing the linens, a surveyor's manual, and a collection of frontier poetry, which she'd found quietly astonishing, and she told him the rules. "You don't move from that chair except to use the necessary," she said. "I'll bring meals here. Jessie is coming tomorrow, and I've written out the tasks. You will advise from the chair." He looked up at her from the chair. There was something in his face she hadn't seen before, not the careful control he usually wore, but something under it. Exposed. The look of a man who has spent years making himself unrequirable, and has just found himself thoroughly required. "Clara," he said. "What?" "Thank you." It was 2 words, entirely insufficient for what they were carrying. She recognized that, and she also recognized that for a man who had spent 20 years making himself smaller than his circumstances. 2 words in that particular voice was not a small thing. "Don't thank me," she said. "Heal properly." She left him there and went to do the morning chores alone, and somewhere between the well and the barn, she acknowledged to herself with the same practical directness she applied to ledgers and pasture rotation that she had stopped thinking of Eli Rourke as an arrangement sometime in the last 6 weeks. She had started thinking of him as someone she would not want to lose. She put that thought in the same mental space where she kept the account books accurate, private, and not something she needed to discuss with anyone yet. He healed. He healed the way she was beginning to understand. He did most things quietly, thoroughly, with an attention to the work of recovery that he hadn't given to the rest that preceded it. By the end of the 3 days, he was moving more easily than he had in weeks, which Doc Hadley attributed to the enforced stillness. And by the end of a week, he was at the east fence with Jesse, not lifting, but directing, standing straight for longer stretches than before, his movement carrying a new confidence that hadn't been there in the first days. The property changed visibly. She noticed it the way you notice things only after they've changed enough that you can see the before and after. Simultaneously, the way the barn stood differently. Now that the south wall was sound, the way the east pasture held the new cattle with its repaired fencing. The way the garden had expanded into the section she and Eli had cleared together on a cool morning in late May, when he'd knelt in the dirt beside her, pulling weeds with his hands, and neither of them had spoken much, but the silence had been companionable rather than vacant. The town noticed too. People notice property before they notice people, which has always been the particular economy of small communities. What the people of Willow Falls observed from a distance, and then increasingly up close, was that the Whitfield place was no longer running down. Jesse Birch mentioned it to his mother. His mother mentioned it at the church social. The church social being what it was, the information distributed itself through 3 counties within a fortnight. Doris Morrison came out one afternoon in early July, nominally to return a pie dish Clara had left at the boarding house before Eli came to stay, in reality, because Doris was the kind of woman who needed to see things with her own eyes before she believed them. She looked at the barn. She looked at the repaired fencing. She looked at the garden. Then she looked at Eli, who was on the porch working on harness leather again, which had become something like his default occupation during daylight hours. Endless, useful, requiring hands, but not a working back. "Well," Doris said to no one in particular. "Have some lemonade, Doris," Clara said. "I will." She sat down. She accepted the lemonade. She looked at Eli with the open appraisal of a woman who has never been embarrassed by her own curiosity. "You're looking better than when you left my place, Mr. Rourke." "I had better circumstances to recover in," he said. Doris glanced at Clara, then back at Eli. "Gerald Holt is going to be annoyed," she said with significant satisfaction. "Why?" Clara asked. "Because he expected this to go badly." Doris sipped her lemonade. "Most of them did. It was supposed to be." She paused with the delicacy of a woman who has decided to be honest, but is measuring the honesty. "It was supposed to solve a problem by making it someone else's problem. 2 problems, really. And instead it appears to have—" She gestured at the property with her glass. "Not done that." "No," Clara said. "It hasn't." Doris looked between them again. "Are the 2 of you—" she started. "We are managing this property together," Clara said with a pleasantness that closed the question like a gate. "Which is what was arranged." Doris nodded in the manner of a woman storing information for later consideration. "Right," she said. "Of course." After she left, Eli said without looking up from the harness leather, "She's going to tell people." "She's going to tell everyone," Clara agreed. "Does that bother you?" Clara thought about it. She thought about the version of herself that had walked into that meeting house 2 months ago, had felt. The eyes had heard, the laughter had driven home through Main Street with a man the town had handed her like a discarded problem. She thought about the version of herself who had stood at the edge of the barn that first evening, watching a stranger assess the damage to her life with quiet eyes and no judgment. "Less than it used to," she said. He looked at her then. And what she saw in his face, that careful, amber-eyed steadiness that she had been reading for 2 months now, was something she had not seen directed at her before. Not admiration exactly, not sentiment. Something more grounded than either. Regard. The specific regard of a person who has been watching someone very carefully and has arrived at a conclusion. She looked away first. "The north pasture rotation starts Monday," she said. "I know," he said. "Darning." The second Tuesday in July arrived with a dry heat and Raymond Alcott's black buggy, And this time he didn't bother with pleasantries. He brought Harold Finch with him. Clara saw them coming down the track from the window and felt the specific cold quality of recognizing something you have been waiting for and hoping wouldn't come. She went to the door. Eli was already on the porch. She didn't know how he'd seen them first. He didn't explain. He was simply already there when she came out, standing with his weight balanced and his arms loose at his sides, the specific posture of a man who is prepared for something. Raymond climbed out of the buggy. Harold Finch climbed out after him with a leather satchel. "Clara," Raymond said, "we need to talk about the East Pasture." "We talked about the East Pasture," she said. "I told you it wasn't for sale. Circumstances have changed." He glanced at Finch, who opened the satchel. "There's a lien on this property. A supplier's lien, unpaid debt on materials your husband purchased before his death. It's come due." Clara's heart stopped. Just for a moment. One full suspended second where the world rearranged itself. "That's not possible," she said. "I've paid every debt Thomas left. Not this one." Raymond's voice was smooth and regretful, which was its most dangerous register. "It was held by a private creditor in Harlan County. The debt transferred when the creditor died. It's now held by a business associate of mine who has decided to call it due." He paused. $42, Clara. With interest, it's come to $67. She didn't have $67. He knew she didn't have $67. That was the entire architecture of this moment. The East Pasture, Raymond said in the voice of a man offering mercy, would cover it with room to spare. "Sign it over. We clear the lien. You keep the rest of the property free and clear of this particular cloud." "And the water access," Eli said. Raymond looked at him. It was the look a man gives something he's been ignoring on purpose. "The creek runs through the East Pasture, yes. Any transaction of that land would naturally make her dependent on your goodwill for her cattle's water," Eli said, "which you would naturally not extend indefinitely." Raymond's expression shifted by a fraction. "I'm not sure this is your concern, Rourke. You're a boarder here." "I'm a partner in this property's operation," Eli said with a quietness so complete it had no temperature at all. "Which means anything that affects this property's future is my concern." "You have no legal standing." "Show me the lien document," Clara said. Harold Finch hesitated, looking at Raymond. "Show it to her," Raymond said. Finch produced it. She took it and read it. Her eyes moved over the page with the careful thoroughness she had developed reading bank documents and contracts. All those things women weren't supposed to understand that she had taught herself to understand because no one else was going to do it for her. She read it twice. Then she handed it to Eli. He read it once. "This is dated 1879, he said. "Yes," Raymond agreed. "Your associate has held this lien for 5 years without calling it due. He was under no obligation to call it at any particular time." "No." Eli looked at him. "He wasn't. But the fact that he chose to call it now, within 2 months of you coming out here twice with offers on the East Pasture, is a timing that would interest a judge in Harlan County, I'd think." Raymond's face didn't change, but something behind it did. "This is a legitimate debt," he said. "I'm not saying it isn't," Eli said. "I'm saying the manner of its collection is worth looking at." He handed the document back to Clara. "Mrs. Whitfield needs 10 days to verify this with an independent party. Any reasonable creditor gives that. The terms of the lien don't require—" "Raymond." Eli's voice dropped one register into something quieter and much more absolute. "You drove out here with a banker in your buggy on a Tuesday afternoon because you thought there'd be a woman alone who'd be frightened enough to sign something before she could think it through. There isn't. Give her 10 days. The yard was very quiet. A horse shifted in the paddock. Raymond Alcott looked at Eli Rourke for a long, measuring moment. And Clara watched something happen that she had not witnessed in years of dealing with Raymond. She watched him recalculate. 10 days, he said. And then this gets handled through proper channels. He got back in the buggy. Harold Finch got back in the buggy. They went down the track. Clara stood on the porch without moving until the buggy was out of sight. Then she said very quietly, "I don't have $67. "I know," Eli said. "After the August payment." "I know." She turned to look at him. "You said you were a partner in this property's operation." He met her eyes. "Yes." "You said that without asking me." "I said it because it's true." His jaw was set. "Whether or not you'd agreed with me in advance." She looked at him for a long moment. Looked at this man who had come to her as a burden, and had instead become the person who stood between her and the next crisis, and the one after that, who had learned the property the way he must have learned the mountain, completely functionally, with total commitment, and who had just told Raymond Alcott to his face that he was a partner here. "We need to verify the lien," she said. "Yes. And we need to find $67 or find grounds to contest it." "Both probably. And we have 10 days. "We have 10 days, he agreed. "So we'd better start tonight." She turned back to the door. "Come inside," she said. "I'll put coffee on." He followed her in, and behind them, the empty yard sat quiet in the July heat, and somewhere down the track, Raymond Alcott was already planning his next approach, and neither of them doubted it. But they were also not the same two people who had driven out of Willow Falls 2 months ago in silence while the town laughed at them. They were something else now. Something that hadn't had a name put to it yet, but that was no less real for the lack of one. Clara put the coffee on. Eli sat at the table and pulled the lien document toward him and began making notes in his careful, unexpectedly neat hand. And the night came down around the house, and the work began, and neither one of them considered stopping. They worked through the night, not dramatically, not with the furious lamp-burning urgency of people in stories who always seem to know exactly what they're looking for. They worked the way people work when the problem is real, and the time is short, and there's nothing romantic about any of it. Clara made a second pot of coffee at midnight. Eli filled 3 pages of notes in his careful hand. She pulled out every document Thomas had ever signed, every receipt, every letter, every ledger entry, and spread them across the kitchen table until there was no surface left. The lion was real. That much was clear by 2 in the morning. Thomas had purchased lumber and iron fittings from a supplier in Harlan County in the spring of 1879, before the illness had taken serious hold, when he'd still had plans for expanding the barn. He'd paid half up front. The remaining balance, $31, had apparently been carried on account with the supplier, a man named Creed Halston, who had died in 1881, and whose estate had apparently been in enough disorder that the debt had simply sat uncollected, until now. "Halston's estate," Eli said, turning the lien document toward the lantern again. "The creditor named here is a land company, Alcott Western Holdings." Clara looked up from the ledger she'd been cross-referencing. "Say that again." He turned the paper so she could read it. She read it twice. Then she sat back in her chair and felt something cold and precise move through her chest, because she understood exactly what she was looking at. "He bought Halston's debts," she said. "He bought the whole estate most likely, or what remained of it." Eli set the paper down. "This isn't a coincidence, Clara. He's been planning this." "For how long?" "Long enough to know about a $31 debt from 5 years ago." His voice was even, but his jaw had that quality of set that she recognized now as the outward limit of his anger. "He's been building toward the east pasture for a long time. We just didn't know it." She looked at the document, the neat legal language, the interest calculated to $67, the specific engineered precision of a trap that had been waiting for the right moment to spring. "He thought the county meeting would do it," she said slowly. "He thought giving me a man who couldn't work would break the property inside a year. And when it didn't, he moved to the next method." Eli looked at her. "He didn't account for the property actually getting stronger." She turned that over in her mind. Raymond Alcott had sat in his fine house and watched her receive a broken man as a joke, and had expected the joke to finish itself. He had expected her to fail quietly the way large women who had spent their lives being underestimated were supposed to fail without sufficient noise to trouble anyone's conscience. She felt something she didn't often let herself feel. Something that lived between rage and purpose, that had no clean name but was not powerless. "What are the grounds for contesting it?" she said. Eli pulled his notes toward him. "The interest calculation is aggressive. He's compounded it in a manner that a Harlan County judge may not uphold on a personal debt of this age and original amount. He tapped the page. And the transfer of the debt to a company in which he has a financial interest, followed by the immediate call of that debt, while simultaneously making offers on the land the debt threatens, that's a pattern a lawyer could work with. I can't afford a lawyer. You might not need one if you go to the right judge. He looked at her steadily. I know a man in Harlan County, name of Augustus Webb. He's a retired circuit judge who does legal consultation now. Fair man, not in Alcott's pocket. If I write to him tonight, we can have a response in 4 days. She looked at him across the table, the lantern between them, 3 pages of his notes, the spread of 5 years of Thomas's paperwork, the coffee going cold in their cups. You know a retired circuit judge, she said. I spent 12 years on a mountain, Clara, not 12 years without contact with the rest of the world. Who are you? She said. It came out almost involuntarily. Not an accusation, a genuine question, the kind that surfaces when a person keeps revealing themselves to be more than the shape you'd assigned them. Something moved in his face. Right now, he said, I'm the man who's going to write to Augustus Webb. And then I'm going to sleep for 3 hours before the cattle need moving. He pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward him. You should sleep. I won't. No, he agreed. But you should. She stayed at the table while he wrote, and he stayed at the table while she organized the documents into a package for Webb, and they worked in the particular silence of 2 people who have stopped needing to perform competence for each other and can simply be competent side by side in the same direction. She thought about what it would have been like to do this alone. She had done almost everything alone for 2 years. She knew the weight of it, the specific exhaustion of being the only one who knew what needed doing, the only one who cared whether it got done, the only one who would be awake at 2 in the morning with the documents spread out and the coffee cold and the next problem waiting past the horizon. She had managed alone. She had not, she realized, been fully alive in the doing of it. She didn't say that. Some realizations needed to be lived with before they were spoken. Eli sealed the letter at 2:30. They banked the fire and went to their respective rooms, and neither of them acknowledged the particular weight of what they'd just spent the night doing together. Not because it didn't have weight, but because naming things prematurely was a way of making them fragile. The letter went out with the Morning Post. 4 days was what Eli had estimated, and 4 days was what it took. The reply arrived on a Saturday in Augustus Webb's cramped but authoritative hand, and Clara read it at the kitchen table, while Eli stood at her shoulder and read it with her. Webb's verdict was precise and not entirely comforting. The lien was legal, the debt was real, the interest calculation was aggressive, but within arguable parameters. However, and this was the word she held on to, the manner of collection created grounds for a petition to the county court requesting a payment extension and independent audit of the interest calculation. Webb could draft the petition for a fee of $12. It would not eliminate the debt, but it would buy time, possibly delay enforcement by 60 to 90 days, and put Raymond Alcott in the position of defending his calculations before a judge. $12 we have, Clara said. Yes. And 60 to 90 days. It's not a solution, Eli said. It's a bridge. What's on the other side of the bridge? He was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about that. She turned to look at him. The timber on the North Ridge, he said. The section above the creek. I surveyed it last month. There's a good stand of hardwood up there that's never been touched. A timber buyer would pay well for selective cutting rights. The land stays yours. They cut only what's marked, and you receive payment for the timber while the land remains productive. She blinked. How do you know about the timber on the North Ridge? Because I walk the property lines every week when my back allows it. He said it the way someone says an obvious thing. It's my home. I want to know what's in it. The word landed between them like something set down carefully. Home. He didn't appear to notice he'd said it. She didn't point it out. How much, she said. Enough to clear the lien and cover 2 months of bank payments conservatively. Possibly more if we negotiate the cutting rights correctly. She looked at him. You've already identified a buyer. The corner of his mouth moved almost a smile, the restrained kind he produced when he'd done something thorough and wasn't going to apologize for it. There's a timber operation out of Millhaven. I sent a letter 10 days ago. They expressed interest. 10 days ago, she said. That was before Alcott came with the lien. Yes. You were already planning for contingencies. I'm always planning for contingencies. He met her eyes. I know what it looks like when a man like Alcott is positioning himself. I grew up watching my father be outmaneuvered by men like that, because he only ever looked at what was directly in front of him. Something moved in his expression, old and decided, and not soft. I don't make that mistake. She sat with that for a moment. With this man who had arrived in her wagon as the town's joke and had spent 3 months quietly learning everything there was to know about the land he'd come to building contingencies. She hadn't asked him to build planning for threats she hadn't yet identified. You were protecting this place, she said. Yes. From the beginning. I was quiet for a count of 3. From the first week, he said. When Alcott came out and I saw how he looked at the east pasture, I started paying attention. She felt something she couldn't quite locate. Gratitude wasn't the right word, and relief wasn't sufficient. And whatever was underneath those 2 words was something she wasn't ready to examine in the middle of a kitchen on a Saturday morning with $12 and a lawyer's letter on the table between them. Write to Webb, she said. Draft the petition. Already have the draft, he said, and produced it from his shirt pocket. She laughed. She hadn't meant to, it came out of her before she could redirect it. A short, genuine laugh that surprised them both, and he looked at her with something startled in his expression, as if he'd heard a sound he hadn't expected from that direction, and found it better than anticipated. You are, she said when she'd recovered, the most prepared man I have ever encountered. I have historically had a great deal of time to prepare, he said dryly. Living alone will do that. She took the draft from him and read it. It was good. It was better than good. Send it today, she said. They sent it that afternoon, and then they waited. And waiting is its own particular kind of difficulty when what you're waiting for is other people's decisions about your life. The days moved. The property moved with them. The timber company sent a representative out from Millhaven on the 10th day, a compact businesslike man named Fletcher, who walked the North Ridge with Eli for 2 hours and came back with mud on his boots and numbers in his notebook. Clara fed them both lunch and listened to them negotiate across her kitchen table, with the focused attention of a woman who had decided that understanding money was non-negotiable, regardless of what convention said about whose province it was. Fletcher offered $300 for selective cutting rights over 18 months. Eli looked at this table for exactly 3 seconds and said, $350, and you start no later than the 1st of September. Fletcher looked at him. Then he looked at Clara. $350. Clara confirmed with a pleasantness that was also final. Fletcher wrote the number down. $350, he agreed. After he left with a signed agreement of intent and a handshake that included Clara as an equal party because Eli had introduced her as such. Without ceremony, she stood in the yard and looked at the North Ridge and thought about $350. It was more money than she had seen in 2 years. Eli, she said. He was folding his copy of the agreement. Yes. The town gave you to me as a joke. He looked up. I want you to know, she said, with the directness she applied to everything that mattered, that I am aware of what you have done for this property and for me in the last 3 months. I am aware that you could have done far less and still honored the arrangement. And I want to say plainly that I am grateful. Not in the way people say grateful when they mean obligated. Genuinely grateful. He looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light was behind him, and she couldn't see his expression as clearly as she wanted to, which was perhaps just as well. Clara, he said. Yes. You don't have to thank me for wanting to be here. The words were simple. They were also the most significant thing he had said in 3 months, and they both knew it, and neither of them moved for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then a horse in the paddock knocked against the fence post, and the world resumed its normal pace, and Eli folded the agreement into his pocket and said he was going to check the cattle, and she said she was going to start supper, and they went their separate ways across the yard, like 2 people who have touched something they're not quite ready to hold yet. The court petition was granted on a Thursday. 60 days, the county clerk's letter said. 60-day enforcement delay, pending independent audit of the interest calculation. Raymond Alcott would need to appear before Judge Calloway in Harlan County on the 14th of September to defend his numbers. Clara read the letter 3 times and then handed it to Eli without a word. He read it once, handed it back, and said, "He won't like this." "No," she agreed. "He'll escalate." "I know. When?" "Soon." She folded the letter. "He's a man who doesn't like to be made to wait. And he especially doesn't like to be made to wait by someone he thought he'd already handled." She was right about the timing, if not the method. Alcott didn't come himself. That was the first sign that things had shifted, that he'd stopped underestimating them enough to handle things personally, and had moved to the kind of pressure that comes through channels. Instead, on the following Monday, 3 of the workers from the Alcott Ranch rode out in the late afternoon and posted themselves at the junction where the Whitfield track met the main road. Just posted themselves, sitting on their horses doing nothing, saying nothing. Jesse Birch, coming back from town with supplies, had to ride past them to get to the property, and he came into the yard white-faced and moving fast. "3 of Alcott's men," he said to Eli before he was fully off the horse. "At the junction." Eli's face didn't change expression. He looked at Clara. "How long?" Clara asked Jesse. "They were there when I went into town 2 hours ago. They're still there now." "They say anything?" "Nothing. Just watched me." Eli set down what he'd been working on. He looked at Clara with an evenness that was also, she had learned, a particular form of intensity. "He wants us to come to him," he said. "Make a move. Ride out to ask what they want, and they report back that we're nervous." "Then we don't go to them," Clara said. "No." He picked up what he'd been working on. "We let them sit." Jesse looked between them. "That's it. We just let them sit there." "If 3 men sitting at a junction is the worst thing Raymond Alcott has," Eli said, "we're doing considerably better than he wanted us to." Jesse was 17 years old, and still at the age where inaction felt like defeat, and he processed this visibly. The work of accepting that sometimes the strongest response is no response at all. "Go put the supplies away, Jesse," Clara said. He went. She looked at Eli. "He's going to try something before the September court date," she said quietly. "Yes?" "Something direct." "Most likely." He met her eyes. "We should tell Webb. If anything happens to the property, any damage, any interference before the court date, it becomes part of the record." She nodded. "I'll write to him tonight." The 3 men at the junction were still there at sunset, gone by morning. They came back the next day and the day after, and Clara and Eli went about the work of the property and did not ride to the junction and did not send anyone to ask questions and did not, as far as Willow Falls could observe, appear particularly troubled. This was in itself a kind of warfare. Clara understood that. The capacity to appear unafraid is not nothing, it is sometimes everything. What she didn't tell Eli was that the nights were harder, that she lay in the dark and ran the numbers, the timeline, the contingencies, and found the gaps, the places where things could still go wrong, where Raymond had leverage. She hadn't accounted for where a bad harvest or a sick animal or a broken wheel could tip the balance back toward disaster. She didn't tell him because she had decided in some part of herself that she was unnecessary. She had managed fear alone for 2 years. She could manage it now. What she had not managed alone was what happened on the 14th night after the court letter arrived. She heard it before she understood it. A sound from outside, wrong quality, wrong rhythm, the kind of sound that bypasses conscious analysis and lands directly in the body as alarm. She was out of bed before she was fully awake. She met Eli in the hallway. He was already dressed, which told her he hadn't been sleeping either. He had the rifle from the hall cupboard, and his face had the still focused quality she had seen in him only once before. The morning Raymond Alcott had come with Harold Finch and the lien document. "South end of the barn," he said. She smelled it then. Smoke. Not heavy, not the rolling, catastrophic smoke of a structure fully alight. The thin, specific smell of something that has just been set and hasn't taken hold yet. She ran. Eli was faster than she expected, faster than his back should have allowed, and they came around the barn together and found it a pile of dry brush stacked against the south wall, the new section they'd repaired with the edge of it still smoldering where it had been lit. Not yet caught the wood. Close. She grabbed the nearest bucket. He was already at the water trough, moving with the controlled speed of a man who has made fast decisions about what mattered and isn't wasting any motion on what doesn't. They put it out in 4 minutes. 4 minutes that were each one of them a separate eternity. When it was done, when there was nothing left but wet ash and charred brush and the smell that would be in her clothes for a week, she stood with the empty bucket in her hand, and she looked at the south wall of the barn. The sound south wall. The one Eli had directed Jesse to build properly 3 months ago, because a barn that could come down in a hard wind could kill a man. She was shaking. She hadn't noticed until now. Clara. Eli's hand was on her arm. Steady. Certain. "I'm all right," she said. "I know you are." He didn't move his hand. "I know." She looked at the burn mark at the base of the wall. Low. Deliberate. The brush stacked just so enough to be a threat, precise enough to be a message. "He couldn't wait for September," she said. "No. This goes to Webb. Tonight." His hand was still on her arm, and she was still shaking, and neither of them was pretending otherwise. "I'll write it tonight." She turned to look at him. He was closer than she'd realized, the two of them standing in the dark with ash on their hands and the smell of smoke and everything. And his face in the darkness was the face of a man who is looking at something. "He is not going to let anyone take." "Eli," she said. "Yes." "Why are you still here?" She hadn't meant it. The way it came out hadn't meant it as a test or an accusation or even quite as a question. It was the thing that had been sitting in her since the beginning. The thing that none of the practical arrangements and timber negotiations and late nights with ledgers had answered. He could leave. He could have left any number of times. The arrangement was satisfied, the obligation was met, nothing legally bound him to this property or to her. He looked at her for a long moment. "Because I don't want to be anywhere else," he said. Simple, unadorned, in the voice he used for true things, low and certain and without performance. She felt it the way you feel something that has been coming for a long time and that you only recognize as inevitable after it arrives. "That's not an arrangement," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not." She looked at his face. This man who had come to her as the town's burden and had become somehow, in the way that slow and honest things become themselves, the person she trusted most in the world. "We'll write to Webb tonight," she said. "Yes." "And then we go to Harlan County on the 14th. Together." "Together," she confirmed. She turned back toward the house, and he fell into step beside her, and she did not look at the barn again because she knew the wall was sound. Eli had made sure it was sound. And now they had 3 weeks before September 14th, and Raymond Alcott had just made the worst strategic error of his career. He had given them evidence. The letter to Webb went out with the Dawn Post, with Clara's account of the night's events written in her own clear hand, and Eli's corroboration attached, and a physical description of the brush pile that Jesse Birch confirmed he had not seen when he left the property the previous evening. Jesse, when told what had happened, went very still in the specific way of a young man who is revising his understanding of how seriously adult situations can turn. "He set fire to your barn," Jesse said. "Someone did," Eli said. "That's a crime." "It is." Jesse looked at the burn mark. Then he looked at Eli with the particular expression of a young person who has decided that a man they admire is someone worth defending and is now trying to figure out how. "What do you need me to do?" he said. Eli looked at him. "Keep your eyes open. Tell me if you hear anything in town about Alcott. Who he's meeting with, what he's saying about this property." He paused. "And keep that to yourself." Jesse nodded with the gravity of 17, given a serious task. "Yes, sir." After Jesse left, Clara said, "He's going to carry that with him for years." "What?" "Whatever you're teaching him." She looked at Eli. "He's learning what a good man does under pressure. That stays." Eli was quiet for a moment. "My father taught me what a man does under pressure too," he said. "I spent 20 years unlearning it." She looked at him. "You've done a thorough job." He looked at her with that expression, the one she'd stopped being able to look at too directly because it said things his mouth hadn't said yet. "Working on it," he said. Webb's response came 6 days before the September court date. He had filed the evidence of the fire with the court. Judge Calloway had taken notice. Raymond Alcott was now required to appear not merely to defend his interest calculations, but to address a secondary complaint of property interference filed by Clara Whitfield, widow of Willow Falls, against Alcott Western Holdings. This changed things, materially. Clara read the letter at the table and felt the specific quality of a shift in momentum. Not victory, not yet, but the ground tilting fractionally in a different direction. "He overplayed," she said. "He thought we'd be gone before September," Eli said. "He thought the fire would frighten you into selling and the court date would become irrelevant. He misjudged his target, significantly." The corner of Eli's mouth moved. To be fair, he had incomplete information about who was living on this property. She looked at him. "You mean you?" "I mean both of us." He met her eyes. "He thought he knew what you were capable of. He looked at you and saw what everyone in that meeting house saw 8 months ago." She knew what the meeting house had seen. She had known it all her life. "And what do you see?" she asked. Howe was quiet for long enough that she felt the question settle into the air between them and become something real, not rhetorical, not casual. "I see the woman," he said carefully, "who walked into a boarding house to collect a man the whole town had handed her as a problem and drove him home without flinching and fed him supper at 6 o'clock. And 3 months later, is still fighting for this property with more intelligence and determination than anyone in Willow Falls has the sense to recognize." She held that. "Eli," she said. "Yes. When this is over." She stopped, started again. "When September 14th is behind us and the debt is cleared and the timber contract is signed, I want to talk to you about what comes next." He looked at her steadily. "So do I," he said. "Not tonight." "No," he agreed. "Tonight we prepare for Harlan County." She nodded. She turned back to the papers. But the thing that had been building between them carefully and honestly, and in the space of real days and real work and real trouble shared, was no longer something either of them could pretend they hadn't noticed. It was there in the room with them, patient as the North Ridge timber, solid as the sound south wall of the barn. It would wait until September 15th. Neither of them intended to make it wait much longer than that. They rode to Harlan County on the 13th of September, the day before the court date, because Eli said he wanted to speak with Webb in person before the hearing, and Clara said she wanted to see the courtroom before she had to stand in it. Neither of them said the other thing, which was that neither of them wanted to make the journey alone. It was the farthest they had traveled together. 4 hours by wagon on a road that was better than the Willow Falls track, but not by a margin that made itself felt in a man's injured back. Eli didn't complain. He sat straight and held the wagon side when the road roughed out and said nothing about it, which was how she knew it cost him. "We could have left earlier," she said around the second hour. "Made a slower pace." "This pace is fine." "Eli." "Clara." He said it in the exact tone she used when she was ending a discussion, and she recognized it and found it both irritating and privately satisfying that he had learned to do that. They arrived in Harlan County in the late afternoon and found the boarding house Webb had recommended clean, reasonable run by a woman named Mrs. Parrish, who had the manner of someone who had housed many people in difficult circumstances and had stopped making it her business to speculate about them. She showed them their rooms without commentary. 2 rooms on the same floor at opposite ends of the hallway, and brought supper up without being asked, because she could see she said that they were tired and had business in the morning and didn't need to go back out. They ate together in the small sitting room off the hallway plates, balanced on their knees, and Webb joined them at 7 o'clock. A small, dry, precise man of about 65, who shook Clara's hand as an equal before he shook Eli's, which she noticed and appreciated. Webb laid the situation out without decoration. The interest calculation was defensible, but aggressive, and Judge Calloway was known to view aggressive creditor mathematics with skepticism. The fire evidence was the stronger element, physical interference with a debtor's property. During active dispute proceedings was something Calloway took seriously. Raymond Alcott would have representation likely. Marcus Pruitt out of the county seat, who was good, but not exceptional. Webb's read was cautiously favorable, which from a man of his precision was approximately as optimistic as anyone was going to get. How will Alcott argue? Eli asked. He'll dispute the connection between his organization and the fire. He can't have done it himself. He was seen at the Elks Lodge that night, which is presumably why he arranged for that evening specifically. Webb's mouth was thin. He'll say the fire was unrelated, coincidence. Can he make that stick? Clara said. Not easily given the timing, but he'll try. Webb looked at her. Mrs. Whitfield Calloway may ask you questions directly. He does that occasionally when he wants to form his own impression of a party. If he does answer simply, don't argue, don't editorialize, let your account speak. I understand. Webb looked between them. He had the look of a man who was about to say something that wasn't strictly legal in nature. Alcott's approach, he said, has consistently been to manufacture conditions where you would have no choice but to sell. The fire was the most aggressive step in that pattern. If Calloway sees the pattern, which I believe he will, the ruling won't just be about the debt. It will be about the conduct. He paused. That could be significant. Clara and Eli walked Webb to the door at 9 o'clock and stood in the hallway after he'd gone, and the boarding house was quiet around them, and Clara felt the particular weight of a night that precedes something large. Try to sleep, Eli said. You first. The corner of his mouth moved. Fair enough. He turned toward his end of the hallway, then stopped. Clara. Yes. He turned back, looked at her with those amber eyes that she had spent 9 months learning to read. Whatever happens tomorrow, he said, you built something real here. That's already true. No court date changes it. She looked at him. At this man who had arrived in her life as the town's discard, and had become without anyone planning it, the steadiest thing in it. Get some sleep, Eli, she said. Yes, ma'am, he said, and she heard just barely the dry warmth in it. The courtroom was a modest room that smelled of old wood and paper, and the specific gravity of decisions made and unmade in the same 4 walls for decades. Clara sat beside Webb at the plaintiff's table, and kept her hands flat on the surface, and her back straight, and her face composed, and she looked at Raymond Alcott across the room, and he looked back at her, and neither of them looked away first, which was a small thing, and also not. Eli sat in the gallery 1 row back directly behind her. She could feel the specific quality of his presence, the way she always could now, as if she'd developed some additional sense over 9 months that was calibrated only to him. Judge Calloway came in at precisely 9 o'clock. He was a heavy-set man with white hair and the eyes of someone who had heard every version of every story and was still somehow interested in the particular version in front of him today. He settled, looked at both tables, and said, "Let's begin." Marcus Pruitt went first because Alcott's team had chosen to open. Pruitt was indeed good, methodical, and clean building. The debt case with the unhurried confidence of someone who knows the numbers are accurate, even if the circumstances around them aren't. $31, legitimately owed, legally transferred interest calculated within the standard parameters of a private creditor agreement. Webb cross-examined on the timeline, specifically on the gap between Halston's death in 1881 and the debt's transfer to Alcott Western Holdings, a gap of 3 years, during which the debt had sat uncollected. When did Alcott Western Holdings acquire the Halston estate assets? Webb asked the representative Pruitt had brought to testify. 1883, the man said. And when did Mr. Alcott first make an offer to purchase land from Mrs. Whitfield? Pruitt objected. Calloway looked at him and overruled him with the mild expression of a man who has already seen where this is going. Earlier this spring, the representative said, with the discomfort of a man watching his answers become someone else's argument. And the debt was called due how many days after Mrs. Whitfield declined that offer? A pause. I'm not certain of the exact 11 days, Webb said. I have both documents. Calloway looked at the document Webb produced. He looked at it for a long time. When Pruitt attempted to reframe, Calloway said, "Mr. Pruitt, I've seen the sequence. Let's move to the matter of the fire." That was the moment Clara felt the ground shift. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, just a subtle change in the room's orientation, the way a river doesn't appear to change direction until you look back and see how far it's curved. Calloway heard the fire evidence. He heard Clara's account, which she delivered in the simple, direct manner Webb had advised, and he heard Eli's corroboration from the gallery. Calloway had requested it specifically, which was the first indication of where his attention was sitting. He heard Pruitt's objection that no physical evidence connected the fire to Alcott specifically. He heard all of it. Then he said, "Mr. Pruitt, is your client present today?" Pruitt hesitated. "Mr. Alcott is not able to." "Mr. Alcott is not present in my courtroom for a hearing he is required by petition to attend." Calloway's voice hadn't changed in temperature. It had changed in something less measurable. "That's noted for the record." He looked down at the papers before him. "We'll recess for 30 minutes. During the recess, Webb leaned toward Clara and said quietly, "He's writing the ruling." "Already? He's a fast reader." Webb's dry expression was as close to optimism as it apparently got. "The absence is significant. Alcott didn't come because he knew the fire evidence was going to be presented, and he didn't want to sit in this room while it was." "That makes him look guilty," Eli said from the row behind. "It makes him look exactly as guilty as he is," Webb said, "which is, I believe, Judge Calloway's preferred state of affairs." Clara looked at the judge's empty bench. 9 months ago, she had been sitting in a different kind of meeting room while Gerald Holt announced that the county's solution to 2 problems was to make them each other's problem. She had driven home through a street full of people who found the whole arrangement amusing. She had arrived at a failing property with a broken man and no money and no allies, and nothing but the particular stubbornness that had gotten her through every difficult thing in her life. She thought about the south wall of the barn, the rotation map on 3 pages of Eli's neat handwriting, the $63 in a strongbox, the timber contract with Fletcher, the letter to Augustus Webb. Every piece of it, every single careful, unglamorous piece of it, built by 2 people who had been handed to each other as a joke. She felt something settle in her chest, permanent and quiet, like a foundation being poured. Calloway came back in exactly 30 minutes. His ruling was 7 minutes long and precise as a surveyor's line. The debt was real. It was owed. He was not dismissing the principal. However, the interest calculation as applied exceeded what could be considered reasonable for a personal debt of this age and original amount, and he was reducing it to the principal of $31, plus simple interest of 4 years at standard rate, bringing the total to $39.40. Furthermore, the timeline of the debt's collection called due 11 days after a rejected land offer by the same holding company that had acquired it constituted, in his view, predatory collection practice. He was referring the matter to the county attorney for review of Alcott Western Holdings' collection practices more broadly. As to the fire, he could not assign criminal responsibility from a civil proceeding. But he was noting for the record that the physical evidence of property interference, its timing, relative to the active dispute, and the absence of the respondent from his own required hearing, created a pattern of conduct that the county attorney would also be advised to examine. Alcott Western Holdings had 30 days to accept the revised debt total or pursue further appeal. Mrs. Clara Whitfield's property was free of enforcement action for the duration. He closed the folder. "Court's adjourned," he said. She didn't cry. She had told herself she wouldn't, and she didn't, though the $39.40 hit her somewhere behind the sternum with a force that surprised her, and she had to hold very still for a moment while the room came back to its normal size. Eli was beside her before she'd fully stood up, not touching her, just present the way he was always present, certain and undemonstrative and entirely reliable. $39.40, she said. "Yes. We have that. We have considerably more than that." She looked at him. He looked back at her. Around the courtroom was moving Webb packing papers, Pruitt speaking in low, tight tones to the representative who'd testified, the court clerk closing his record book, And none of it was as real as Eli's face in front of her, reading her the way he always did, with that unhurried amber attention that had been, she understood now, the first thing about him she had trusted. "Let's go home," she said. "Yes," he said. "Let's." Webb walked them out and shook both their hands and said he would forward his final invoice to the Whitfield property, and added with the one personal remark she'd ever heard him make that in 40 years of legal work, he had found that the cases where justice actually served its intended purpose were rarer than people believed, and that today was one of the good ones. They were back on the road to Willow Falls by noon. The return trip was different from the journey out. The weight that had occupied the wagon with them going was gone or changed, replaced by something lighter and more complicated at once. Clara was aware of the afternoon around her, the quality of the September light, the sound of the horses. Eli beside her with his hat pushed back slightly and his shoulders carrying less than they had yesterday. They didn't talk for the first hour. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was the particular silence of two people who have just been through something together and are letting it settle before they try to put words to it. Then Eli said, "My father told me once that a man's worth was measured by what he could hold on to." She glanced at him. "Land, money, family," he continued. "The things you could show. The things you could point to and say, 'This is mine, I built this proves I'm not what you said I was.'" He looked at the road. "I spent most of my life believing that. Chasing the version of myself that would finally be worth pointing to. And now," she said, "now I think he was wrong about the measuring." He was quiet for a moment. "I think worth is in the staying. In being the person who's there when the fire gets set, and the court date comes, and the coffee goes cold at 2 in the morning. That's what proves anything." She held that. The road moved under them. A hawk crossed ahead low and fast. "You stayed," she said. "I did." "When you didn't have to." "I had to," he said. "Just not in the way the arrangement said." He looked at her, then directly the way he looked at things he had decided about. "I stayed because leaving wasn't something I was going to do. Not from this property, not from you." She looked back at the road. Her hands were steady on the reins, and her heart was doing something she hadn't felt in so many years she'd nearly forgotten the specific rhythm of it. "Eli," she said. "Yes. When we get home," she said. "I want to talk about what you said, about staying." "So do I," he said. "Not on the road." "No," he agreed. "At home." At home. The word had a different sound when he said it than it had had 9 months ago, when he'd said it without noticing, and she'd noticed without saying. It had the sound of something chosen. They got back to the property in the early evening, and Jesse Birch was there, which was unexpected. He was sitting on the porch step and stood up fast when they came into the yard with the expression of someone who has been waiting and is not sure whether his news is still the right size, given that things seem to have already shifted. "How did it go?" he said. "Well," Clara said. Jesse's whole body changed. 16 months of watching this property and the two people on it condense into a single exhale of relief that was entirely too adult for 17 and made her feel something warm and specific in her chest. "He lost," Jesse said. "He didn't get what he came for," Eli said, climbing down from the wagon with the careful ease that was now genuinely easier than it had been 3 months ago. "The debt is reduced to $39, and the county attorney is looking at his collection practices. That's a worse day than he planned." Jesse grinned. It was the grin of a young man who has chosen a side and seen it vindicated, and it was the best kind of grin there is. "The whole town's been talking," he said. "Doris Morrison told Mrs. Alcott at the church that you'd gone to Harlan County, and then everyone knew, and half of them—" He stopped. "Half of them are hoping you won." Clara looked at him. "Only half. The other half worked for Alcott," Jesse said with the pragmatism of someone who has been paying attention. "But Mrs. Whitfield Doris Morrison said something at the church social that I thought you should know." He shifted his hat. "She said that the town made a mistake. About you. About Mr. Rourke. She said it out loud in front of everyone, and nobody argued with her." Clara was quiet for a moment. "That's very kind of Doris," she said. "She means it," Jesse said. I think a lot of them do. He looked at Eli. The way things have changed out here, people see it. They talk about it. Eli looked at the property. Clara looked at it too. Looked at it the way she'd looked at Eli's rotation map 9 months ago, seeing the before and after. At once the thing it had been and the thing it was becoming. Go home, Jesse, Eli said. Tell your mother the Whitfield property is in good order. Jesse went, still grinning, and they stood in the yard in the September evening, and the property sat around them. The sound barn, the repaired fence line, the north pasture, thick with grass. The new cattle settled, and the old ones settled beside them. And it was all exactly as they had left it, except that now there was nothing threatening it. Clara crossed the yard to the porch and sat down on the step where Jesse had been, which was something she almost never did. She was always moving, always toward the next task. She sat down and looked at the property in the evening light. Eli came and sat beside her. Not at the other end. Beside her. Their shoulders were almost touching. You said you wanted to talk, he said. I did. About staying. About staying. She looked at the barn, at the south wall, at the specific solid reality of a thing built to last. When you came here, she said, I told myself this was an arrangement. I told myself that very precisely because I needed it to be an arrangement and not something else because something else felt dangerous. Yes, he said. And then it became something else anyway. Yes, without either of us deciding to. She turned to look at him. His face in the evening light was the face she knew best in the world. Now every line of it, every controlled expression, and the things beneath the controlled expressions. I'm not a woman who has been given a great deal of evidence that I am worth. She stopped. Chose again. That someone would choose me, without condition, without arrangement. He turned to face her fully. I know, he said. I'm telling you that, so you understand what it means when I say. She held his eyes. I would choose you, not the arrangement, not the arrangement's version of you. You. He was very still. The man who wrote to Augustus Webb before I knew I needed him to, she said. The man who sat on my kitchen floor and let me take care of him. The man who taught Jesse Birch how to set a post. The man who said I don't want to be anywhere else in the dark next to a burned barn wall. She didn't look away. That man. I would choose him. Choose. Eli Rourke looked at Clara Whitfield for a long moment. In that moment, she saw something she had not seen on his face before. Not the controlled stillness he wore like a second skin. Not the careful management of a man who had learned to keep himself at a distance from things that could be taken away. Something unguarded. Something that had been waiting behind everything else for a long time. Clara, he said. Yes, I have not, he said carefully, been chosen in a very long time. I had forgotten what it felt like to be seen clearly by another person and have them not look away. She held his gaze. I'm not looking away, she said. He reached out and took her hand. Not with urgency, with the specific deliberateness of a man who does things when he's decided to do them, and not a moment before. His hand was large and work-roughened and entirely certain, and hers was not small, and neither of them pretended to be less than they were. I would like, he said with the same care he gave to everything true, to stop being an arrangement. So would I, she said. They sat on the porch step in the September evening, with their hands together, and the property around them, and the sound of the north pasture in the distance. And neither of them felt the need to say anything else for a while. The stars came out the way they always did, without being asked. October moved in with the particular kindness that season sometimes has in the West. Cool mornings, and warm afternoons, and the quality of light that makes everything look like it's being seen for the first time. The timber crew from Millhaven came on the 3rd of the month and began their work on the North Ridge, and Clara received the first payment installment, $120, on a Tuesday morning that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the Tuesday that had started all of this. She paid Augustus Webb his $12. She paid the court-reduced debt of $39.40. She made the October bank payment with room to spare, and looked at Harold Finch across his desk with the specific composure of a woman who no longer needs to perform calm, because she has arrived at actual calm, and he stamped her ledger without making her feel the weight of it, which was perhaps the first time he'd ever managed that. She rode home with receipts in her pocket and something in her chest that she had not had the last time she made this ride. Not relief. Something more durable. When she came into the yard, Eli was at the east fence, not repairing it this time, just checking it, walking the line the way he did every week, knowing every post by the particular way it stood. He saw her and came toward the wagon, and she could see in the way he moved that his back was better than it had been, genuinely better. The careful gait replaced by something approaching what she imagined was his natural stride, long and unhurried and unafraid of distance. "How did it go?" he said. She handed him the receipts. He looked at them. All of them. The bank stamp, Webb's receipt, the court payment. He held them in his hands for a moment. "It's done," he said. "It's done." He handed them back. His eyes moved to her face with that direct, unhurried regard she had stopped trying to look away from. "How do you feel?" She thought about it honestly. "Like I can breathe," she said. "Like I've been breathing through something narrow for a very long time, and I didn't know how narrow until just now." He nodded. "Good," he said. "That's good." He looked at the property, then back at her. "There's something I want to ask you." She waited. "I want to ask you," he said with the specific care of a man who has been thinking about his words for some time, "whether you would consider making this permanent." She looked at him. "The partnership. More than the partnership." He held her gaze. "I'm asking you to marry me, Clara. Not because of the property, not because of any arrangement, not because of what the county or the town or anyone else thinks ought to happen. Because I want to spend the rest of my life on this land with you, and because you are the person I trust most in the world, and because I believe we are—" He paused. "Better together than either of us has ever managed alone." The yard was very quiet. A horse in the paddock shifted. The wind moved through the north pasture. Clara Whitfield looked at this man, this difficult, careful, prepared, steadfast man, who had come to her as a burden and had made himself, without anyone planning it, into the foundation of everything. "Yes," she said. Simple, unadorned, in the voice she used for true things. He exhaled just slightly, just enough, and she understood that he had not been entirely certain, which meant the asking had cost him something real, and the fact that it had cost him something made it worth more than anything offered cheaply. "Yes," she said again, because some things deserve to be said twice. He stepped forward, and she stayed where she was, and he took her face in his hands, those large, work-roughened, certain hands, and he looked at her the way he had learned to look at the property, like something worth knowing completely, something worth staying for. He kissed her. And she let herself be kissed, and she kissed him back, and there was nothing performed in it, and nothing withheld, and no audience for it, but the north ridge and the October sky, and the sound of the property around them, steady and alive and entirely theirs. They told Jesse first, because he deserved to know first, and because the look on his face when they told him was something Clara intended to keep for a long time. Pure, uncomplicated joy, the kind that hasn't yet learned to be skeptical about happiness, about time. Jesse said with 17's magnificent authority on subjects it has no experience with, and Eli laughed a real laugh, not the dry, almost laugh she'd learned to recognize, but something fuller, less guarded, the laugh of a man who has decided he doesn't need to keep that much distance anymore. She had not heard him laugh like that before. She found she wanted to hear it again. Doris Morrison found out the way. Doris found out everything, and she appeared at the property 2 days later with a jar of preserved plums, and what Clara could only describe as vindicated satisfaction, radiating from her entire person. Gerald Holt sent a formal note of congratulation that had the quality of a man who was trying to take credit for an outcome he had accidentally produced. Raymond Alcott said nothing, because Raymond Alcott was occupied with the county attorney's inquiry into his collection practices, which was where he belonged. The town talked as towns talk. But the conversation had changed. It had changed the way conversations change when the story they've been telling about someone turns out to be wrong, and the evidence is standing in front of them being too real and too solid to ignore. What the town of Willow Falls had handed Clara Whitfield was a broken man they didn't want. What they had watched her build over 9 months of work and trouble, and 2 in the morning ledger sessions and fires put out, and courts attended, and hands held in September evenings, was a life. And the man they had handed her, the man they had intended as a joke, was going to marry her on the first Saturday of November in the Willow Falls Church, in front of anyone who wanted to come and see what an underestimated woman and a man the world had discarded had made of themselves when given the same chance everyone else took for granted. Clara thought about that on the last night of October, sitting at the kitchen table with the account book open and the numbers finally in a column she could look at without the cold quality of dread. She thought about the meeting house, about Gerald Holt's patient, amused voice, about driving home through Main Street with Eli sitting straight and silent beside her while the town laughed. Eli came to the kitchen doorway. "Come to bed," he said. Not presumptuous, they had kept their propriety through the engagement, because she had not spent her whole life being misjudged to give anyone new reasons. But the word bed in his voice had the new quality that everything in his voice had. Now warmer, less fortified. The voice of a man who had let himself back into his own life. "In a minute," she said. He came to the table and looked at the account book over her shoulder. She felt him read the numbers the same way she had the specific relief of them. "Good," he said. "Very good," she said. His hand came to rest on her shoulder. Easy, certain." "One more day," he said. "One more day," she agreed. She covered the account book and reached up and put her hand over his, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the October night was clear, and tomorrow was November, and in 4 days she was going to marry the man the town had given her as a burden. She had never in her entire life been so grateful for someone else's underestimation. The first Saturday of November arrived with cold air and a sky so clear it looked like something deliberate. Clara stood in the small room behind the church vestibule in the dress she had made herself, dark blue wool, cut to fit the body. She actually had not some imagined smaller version of it, and she looked at her hands and thought about all the things those hands had done in the last 10 months. The ledgers, the garden, the fire bucket in the dark. The lean document passed across a kitchen table. Eli's hand in hers on a September porch step. Doris Morrison was there fussing with the back of Clara's collar, in the way of a woman who needs to be useful with her hands when her feelings are running ahead of her composure. "You look beautiful," Doris said. "I look like myself," Clara said. "Yes," Doris said with a firmness that surprised her. "That's what I meant." Clara turned to look at her. Doris, who had housed Eli in a narrow room and counted the days until someone took the problem off. Her hands was looking at her now with something genuine and a little undone in her expression. The look of a woman who has witnessed a thing she didn't expect and is still catching up to it. "I should have said something earlier," Doris said. "To the town, at the meeting house. I should have said something then." "You said something at the church social," Clara said. "Jessie told me." "That was months too late." "Doris." Clara put a hand on her arm. "It's all right. It's all right now." Doris pressed her lips together and nodded and went back to fussing with the collar, and Clara let her, because some people need a task to carry their tenderness, and there was nothing wrong with that. Jessie knocked on the door at 5 minutes to the hour. He had his father's good jacket on, and his hair combed in the effortful way of a young man who has tried very hard and achieved approximate success, and he was trying to maintain a 17-year-old's dignity and failing completely because his face was doing too many things at once. "They're ready," he said. "Mr. Rourke is—" He stopped, swallowed. "He looks good, Mrs. Whitfield. Real good." She smiled at him. "Thank you, Jessie. He turned his hat in his hands. "I wanted to say, before, that watching you two this past year has been—it's the most." He ran out of words, which happened to Jessie occasionally, when feelings outpaced vocabulary, and he looked at the floor and then back at her and said simply, "I'm going to remember this." "So am I," she said. She walked out of the side room and down the short hall and through the door into the church, and she did it alone because she had no father living and no brother present, and because she had learned over 41 years that she was fully capable of walking herself into the important moments of her life. The church was not full, but it was fuller than she had expected. Doris Morrison, Jesse Birch and his mother and father, Doc Hadley, George Purvis, who had sold her the cattle, Fletcher from the Millhaven Timber Company, who had apparently made the trip specifically, Augustus Webb, which astonished. The retired circuit judge from Harlan County had come 60 miles for a wedding. He had no practical reason to attend, and he stood in the back row with his precise, dry face arranged into something that was probably his version of warmth. And along the other rows, people from Willow Falls. Not everyone. Not the Alcott contingent who were otherwise occupied. But enough. More than enough. Faces she recognized, faces that had watched her drive through Main Street 10 months ago, and some of which had laughed, and some of which had looked away, and some of which had felt things they hadn't had the courage to say. They were here now. She looked at all of them for exactly 1 second, and then she looked at Eli. He was standing at the front of the church in a dark jacket she hadn't seen before. He had apparently obtained it without telling her, which was entirely in character, and his hair was combed and his jaw was clean-shaved, and he was standing straight in a way that had nothing of effort in it anymore. The way a man stands when his body has healed and his life has reoriented around something real. He was looking at her, only at her. The room did not appear to exist for him in any meaningful way while she was walking toward him. She reached him. He took her hand. "You made the dress," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "I did. It's perfect." "It fits," she said. "Yes," he said with everything that word was carrying. "It does." Reverend Aldous was a compact, serious man who had been performing weddings in Willow Falls for 20 years and had developed a sense for which ones were going to last. He looked at Clara and Eli for a long moment before he opened his Bible, and whatever he saw appeared to satisfy some internal measure, because he nodded slightly to himself and began. The vows were the traditional ones. Clara had considered writing her own and decided against it, not because she lacked words, but because the traditional ones, said plainly by two people who meant them all the way down, were sufficient. To have and to hold, to love and to cherish, in sickness and in health. She had already seen sickness. She had already seen health returning. She had already held things together in the dark with this man, and been held together by him, and none of the vows were abstract. When Eli said "I do," his voice was low and even and absolute. The voice he used for things he had decided completely, and he had decided this as completely as she had ever seen him decide anything. When she said "I do," she said it looking straight at him, with all 41 years of her life that had arrived at this moment, and she did not look away. Reverend Aldous pronounced them married. Eli kissed her with the same deliberateness he brought to everything important, certain and unhurried and real. And behind them, she heard Doris Morrison make a sound that she would describe later if asked as a dignified emotional response, and Jesse Birch say something under his breath that sounded like "finally," and Augustus Webb doing absolutely nothing, because Augustus Webb was the kind of man who expressed approval through presence and not noise, but he was there, and that was the whole of what needed saying. Done. There was no grand reception. Clara had not wanted one, and Eli had agreed with her, and so they opened the property to whoever wanted to come and set out food. Her cooking, which was substantial and good, and let the afternoon be what it was. People came. That surprised her a little even now. They came to the property that 10 months ago they had watched receive a broken man as a civic joke, and they came with the slightly chastened quality of people who are aware that they have arrived late to an understanding they should have reached sooner. Gerald Holt came, which she had not expected. He stood in the yard with his hat in his hands, and he looked at the barn, the sound barn, the repaired fence, the thriving cattle. And then he looked at Clara with the expression of a man assembling an apology that is larger than he is accustomed to making. "The property looks well," he said. "It is well," she said. "I want to say—" He stopped, looked at his hat, looked up. "The arrangement we made. It wasn't, I didn't think it was cruel at the time. I thought it was practical. I want to say that I understand now that there's a kind of cruelty in practical decisions that dismiss what people are capable of." Clara looked at him. Gerald Holt was not a terrible man. He was an ordinary man who had made ordinary assumptions about an extraordinary woman, which was a failing so common it barely had a name. "Gerald," she said, "the arrangement worked out." "It did," he said. Better than any of us. Better than any of you expected, she said. Because none of you expected much. She said it without anger. Just accurately the way Eli always said true things. But we're here now. And the property is sound, and the debt is cleared, and I have a husband I chose. She met his eyes. Let's let that be what it is. He nodded, shook her hand, moved off toward the food table, looking slightly more honest than when he'd arrived, which was perhaps the best outcome available. Eli appeared at her side. He had seen the exchange from across the yard. She was certain of it, in the way he always saw things from across yards. Well handled, he said. He meant it mostly, she said. Yes. He looked at where Gerald was now talking to Doc Hadley. People mostly mean things when they're forced to examine them closely enough. A pause. It's the examination they resist. She leaned against him slightly, just her shoulder against his arm, and he didn't move away. Your father never examined anything, she said. Did he? No, Eli said. He died certain he'd been right about everything. He was quiet for a moment. I spent a long time being angry about that. Then I spent a long time trying to become the opposite of him and not quite managing it. Then I came down off a mountain with a broken back and ended up in a widow's wagon, and somewhere in the middle of that, it stopped mattering so much what he thought and started mattering more what I thought. He looked at her. Of myself. And what do you think? She asked. He considered it with the same care he gave everything. That I'm a man who stayed, he said, when it was hard, when it would have been easier not to. He looked at the property, all of it, the whole of what they'd made. That's enough. She took his hand. That's everything, she said. Fletcher from Mill Haven pulled her aside after lunch, slightly apologetic about the timing and entirely businesslike in his manner, which she respected. Mrs. Rourke, he said, and the name was so new it landed differently than she expected, and she saw him notice her register it. My apologies. I wanted to raise something, and I didn't want to let the trip go without doing it. Go ahead. The North Ridge timber has been exceptional. Better grade than we anticipated. We're ahead of schedule. He looked at the ridge. There's a second stand east of the creek on the high ground. We didn't include it in the original contract. He named a figure. It was a substantial figure. I'll discuss it with my husband, she said, and felt the word husband sit in her mouth with the specific solidity of something true. She found Eli 20 minutes later and told him the number. He looked at her with those amber eyes and said, What do you think? Not what do I think. What do you think? She thought about it. I think we should take it, she said. I think we use the additional capital to expand the cattle operation. I've been looking at the east pasture. If the water access question is permanently resolved, there's capacity for twice what we're running. He nodded slowly. The water access question becomes permanent when we own the creek outright, he said. Or when we have a documented legal easement. Either is achievable. Webb, he confirmed. She found herself smiling. We're already planning the next thing. We're always planning the next thing, he said. That's how things get built. She thought of his father, who had never planned for the next thing because he'd been too occupied defending his certainty about the current thing. She thought of Thomas, who had managed, rather than planned, who had looked at this property and seen its limitations before its possibilities. She thought of herself 10 months ago sitting alone in a meeting house while a room full of people decided her circumstances. None of those things had prepared her for the life she was standing in now, and all of them had in their way made her exactly capable of it. The guests left by late afternoon, gradually in the way of people who have been fed well and have stayed as long as politeness suggested and slightly longer because they didn't quite want to leave. Jesse was last, which was appropriate, because Jesse had been the most consistent witness to the whole of the thing. He shook Eli's hand, a serious handshake man to man, the kind Jesse was still growing into, but was already practicing with care. Sir, he said. Eli gripped his hand. Come Tuesday, he said. I want to show you the east section. Jesse's face did the thing it always did when Eli gave him something real to learn. Yes, sir. He turned to Clara, and she hugged him, which surprised him, and then didn't. And he hugged her back with the slightly awkward sincerity of a young man who has not yet learned to receive affection without showing that it matters. "Mrs. Rourke," he said. "Jessie," she said. I went down the track on his horse and they watched him until he was gone, and then they were alone on the property in the November afternoon, which was exactly where they both wanted to be. Eli looked at the barn. She knew what he was doing, the same thing she did, the same inventory, the same habit of checking the things they'd built to make sure they were still standing. South wall sound, east fence tight, north pasture settled, cattle accounted for. "Everything's in order," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "Come inside," he said. "It's getting cold." She followed him in. The kitchen was warm from the afternoon's cooking, and the fire she'd banked before the ceremony, and the table had the comfortable disorder of a day fully lived on it. And she stood in the middle of it and looked at the room that had been hers alone for 2 years and was now something else entirely. Eli put the kettle on without asking, because he knew she wanted tea at the end of a long day, and she sat at the table and watched him move in her kitchen. Their kitchen with the particular ease of a man who has learned the geography of a place so completely that he inhabits it rather than occupying it. She thought, "I have been so lonely, for so long, and then I am not lonely now." And those two thoughts sat beside each other in her chest, the before and the after, and she let them both be true. 3 weeks after the wedding, the county attorney's office sent a formal notice that the investigation into Alcott Western Holdings collection practices had resulted in findings sufficient to warrant civil action. 2 other families in Harlan County had had debts called in under similar circumstances. The same pattern, the same timing, relative to land offers the same engineered pressure. Those families had lost land they should not have lost. Raymond Alcott would not recover from this quietly. Clara read the notice and passed it to Eli. He read it, set it down. "Those other families," he said. "I know. They weren't as fortunate." "No." She looked at the notice. "Is there anything we can do?" He looked at her. "Webb might know if there's a civil recovery action possible for them. If the collection was predatory, there may be grounds to challenge the original transfers." She was already moving toward the writing desk. "I'll write to him today." He watched her for a moment. "You know this is not your responsibility," he said, not discouraging her, just noting. "I know," she said. "I'm doing it anyway." He came and stood beside the desk while she wrote, not hovering, just present. And she wrote to Webb with the same clear directness she'd learned was the most efficient form of communication with precise men. And when she was done, she folded the letter and handed it to Eli, and he looked at it for a moment. "You're a good woman," he said. "I'm a practical one," she said. "Both," he said. "Those two things are not in conflict." She looked up at him. His face was the face she knew best. Every line of it, every restrained expression, and everything beneath the restraint. And she thought about the morning she'd walked into Doris Morrison's boarding house, and a voice had said, "I told Morrison, I don't want visitors through a closed door," and she had said, "I'm not a visitor," and meant it more truly than she'd known. She was not a visitor in this man's life. She had never been. "Eli," she said. "Yes." "Are you happy?" He looked at her with an expression she'd learned to read as the closest thing he had to surprised, not the surprise of shock, but the surprise of a question that goes directly to something real. "Yes," he said. Not quickly, not reflexively. With the specific weight of a man who has checked the answer against the facts of his life and found them in agreement. "So am I," she said. "I want you to know that. I don't say it enough." "You show it," he said. "I want to say it too." He sat down across from her at the desk and looked at her with those amber eyes, and she held the look, and outside the November wind was doing something around the eaves of the house, a cold and honest sound. And the fire in the next room was warm, and she was 41 years old and not lonely, and the property was sound. "Then say it," he said. "I'm happy," she said. "Here, with you, building this." He reached across the desk and put his hand over hers. "So am I," he said. "God help me after everything. So am I." The first real twist came in the second week of December, on a morning that arrived like any other morning, and then became something else entirely. She found the letter in the post when Jessie brought it up from town. It had a return address. She didn't recognize a law office in Denver, Colorado, with a name that meant nothing to her. She opened it at the kitchen table while Eli was at the barn. She read it once, and then sat very still for a moment. Then she read it again. The letter was from the estate office of a man named Robert Eli Rourke, Eli's father. He had died in October, 4 weeks before their wedding. He had left after debts and estate costs were settled a parcel of land in the Colorado Territory. Approximately 200 acres of mixed timber and grazing land north of Denver. The estate had taken some months to locate next of kin. The attorney was writing to inform Elias James Rourke that he was the sole heir. She sat with the letter until she heard his footsteps on the porch. He came through the door and saw her face and stopped. "What is it?" he said. She handed him the letter. She watched him read it. Watched his face go through things that were quick and complicated and not all the same thing. Something sharp at first, then something more measured, then a stillness that was different from his ordinary stillness. This one was the stillness of a man who has just received news about a wound he thought had closed and found it was deeper than he knew. He lowered the letter. "He's gone," he said. "Yes. He left me land. 200 acres. He set the letter on the table and looked at it. He never said a word to me. Not in 37 years, not after I left, not a single letter. His jaw moved. And now he leaves me land. Does it change anything?" she said carefully. "About how you feel?" He thought about it. Actually thought about it, which was the only way he did anything. "No," he said at last. "He's still the man who told me I was a burden in front of my brothers." He looked up. "But he's also gone. And I can't—" He stopped. "I'd rather have had one honest conversation with him than 200 acres." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "I know," she said. He turned his hand over and held hers. "It doesn't change anything," he said. "Here, us, this." "No," she agreed. "But 200 acres," he said, and something very dry appeared in his voice. The specific humor that surfaced in him when things were too large for straight-faced treatment is 200 acres. She felt the laugh before it arrived. "It is that." He looked at her. "What do you think we should do with it?" She thought about it. "I think we go see it," she said. "Together, in the spring, and we decide what it is when we can look at it." "Together," he said. "Together," she confirmed. He nodded slowly. He looked at the letter one more time. Then he folded it and set it aside and picked up his coffee cup, and she watched him take a breath, long and deliberate, the breath of a man processing something large and choosing not to let it flatten him. "Eli," she said. "Yes. I was wrong about you. Whatever else he was wrong about that. From the beginning." He looked at her with the unguarded expression she'd only seen a handful of times, the one that existed before the controlled stillness reassembled itself. "I know," he said. "You and this property and the last 10 months have made that rather clear." The corner of his mouth moved. "I'm grateful for the evidence." "Any time," she said. He reached out and tucked a piece of hair behind her ear, a gesture so simple and domestic and entirely new that it caught her off guard, and she felt it the way you feel small things that are actually enormous, that are actually the whole of something. "Spring," he said. "Colorado." "Spring," she agreed. "Colorado." January came, and the property went into its winter rhythm, the work shifting inward, the days shorter, the cattle settled, and the timber operation paused until the weather broke. Eli's back had healed to the point where Doc Hadley pronounced himself satisfied in the particular way of doctors who expected less and got more, and Eli marked this by doing something Clara only noticed because she knew every variation of his movement. He stopped being careful. Not reckless, not foolish. Just stopped managing himself as though he were a man in recovery and started moving like a man who was simply himself, fully in his own body. She noticed the first morning he got up before her, and had the fire built and the kettle on before she reached the kitchen. "You beat me up," she said. "Your turn to sleep," he said. "I don't need extra." Clara. The same tone. The same tone she used on him. "Drink your tea." She drank her tea. Jesse came twice a week through January because Eli had taken to teaching him in the way of a man who has realized that what he knows is worth passing on and has stopped waiting for a formal occasion to pass it on. Surveying. Timber assessment. The calculation of a property's carrying capacity. The things that were not glamorous and not romantic and were the entire difference between a ranch that lasted and a ranch that didn't. Jesse absorbed everything with the specific hunger of a young person who has found the thing he was built for. His father came out in the third week of January and stood in the yard watching his son work a fence line under Eli's direction, and afterward he found Clara in the garden turning the winter soil, and he said, "Whatever he's learning out here, Mrs. Rourke, it's more than fencing." "I know," she said. "I wants to ranch," his father said. He told his mother. He said Mr. Rourke is showing him how. She thought about Eli saying my father never taught me anything useful. She thought about what it meant that a man who had been told he was a burden had become the person a boy wanted to learn from. "He's a good teacher," she said. Jesse's father nodded. "He's a good man," he said. "And the town knows it now. Whatever we were thinking last year." He stopped. "We were wrong." She let him have the sentence. Some things didn't need her to add to them. She turned back to the garden soil and above her. The January sky was clear and cold and permanent, and the property was quiet in the way of things that are secure, and she thought about what Eli had said on the porch in September, "Because I don't want to be anywhere else," and she understood now what he'd meant in the fullest possible way. Not just the property, not just the circumstances, not just the practical truth of two people whose skills had fitted together like opposing halves of a workable whole. Here. He had meant here, and here was wherever she was, and that was the thing she had never in her life been given before, and now had, and she did not intend to spend 1 hour of it in the doubt that had occupied most of her previous 41 years. February brought snow, and snow brought the particular intimacy of a house that cannot be left for long periods, and that intimacy revealed a truth that Clara had known functionally for months, and now knew completely. She and Eli Rourke were extraordinarily well suited to being in the same room, not because they were alike. They were not especially alike. She was forthright where he was measured. She moved through problems by talking them outward. He moved through them by going inward and emerging with conclusions. She found most people interesting until they gave her reason not to. He found most people cautious-making until they gave him reason to trust them. But they agreed on the things that were not negotiable: the value of honesty, the importance of the work itself, the worth of a person being independent of the category into which other people had sorted them. They agreed most fundamentally on what mattered. One evening in February, deep in the snow month, they were sitting by the fire, she with the account book, he with the surveyor's manual that was apparently inexhaustible as a text, and she looked up and found him already looking at her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I was just looking." "At what?" He lowered the book. "At you," he said simply. "At the specific fact of you here in this house that you saved, that is more than it was because of what you did. At the woman that room full of people underestimated." He paused. "I look at you sometimes, and I think about how close I came to not being here." She felt that in her sternum, the same way she'd felt the court ruling. "What do you mean?" "When they told me about the arrangement," he said, "at the boarding house, before you came, I was angry. I told myself I wouldn't do it, that I'd rather stay in that room until Doris Morrison's patience ran out than be handed to someone as a charity case." He looked at the fire. "I nearly refused." She was very still. "What changed your mind?" she asked. He looked at her. "You knocked on the door," he said. "And you said I'm not a visitor. And I'd been sitting in that room for 8 months with people speaking to me in the particular voice people use for problems they feel guilty about having, and you—" He stopped. "You sounded like someone who had made a decision and was here to follow through on it, and didn't require my approval to proceed. He paused. I wanted to see who that was. She thought about that moment. The closed door. The voice she hadn't known yet. The complete uncertainty of what was on the other side. I wanted to leave too, she said, before I knocked, standing in the hallway. He looked at her. I'd told myself the whole drive over that it was an arrangement, and arrangements were manageable, she said. And then I was standing outside that door, and I thought, this is a man. I don't know, in a situation neither of us chose, and the only thing we have in common is that a room full of people found us both inadequate. She held his eyes. And then I knocked anyway. He looked at her for a long moment. I'm glad you knocked, he said. So am I, she said. Clara. Yes, I love you. He said it with the same directness he brought to everything true, not with build-up or preamble, just the fact of it clean and certain as a fence post driven deep. I should have said it before today, and I didn't, because I kept finding reasons why the timing wasn't right, and I have now decided that the timing is always going to feel insufficient for something this significant, so. She felt it land through her in layers, the way deep things do. First the surface, and then below it, and then deeper still down into the places that had been quiet and closed for a very long time. I love you, she said. I should have said it before today too. I was afraid of how much I meant it. He reached for her hand. Don't be afraid of it, he said. I'm not, she said. Not anymore. They sat in the firelight with their hands together and the snow coming down outside, and there was nothing between them but truth, and it was enough. More than enough. It was everything two people needed who had spent their whole lives being told they weren't enough and had turned out to be exactly sufficient for each other in every way that mattered. Spring came as springs do, without ceremony and with complete authority, and they made their plans for Colorado. Augustus Webb had handled the estate paperwork with his usual precision. The 200 acres were legally transferred to Elias James Rourke as of the 1st of March. They would go in April after the timber crew resumed work, and Jesse's father agreed to oversee the Willow Falls property for 2 weeks in their absence. They would see the land together, as she had said, and they would decide what it was when they could look at it. On the last evening of March, Eli stood at the east fence, the fence he had checked and repaired and learned every post of, and looked at the property in the direction of the North Ridge, where the timber operation hummed with quiet industry, and then east toward the creek and the pasture that was theirs. The water access documented and legally secure, and south toward the barn with its sound wall, and west toward the house with its warm kitchen and its evening fire. Clara came and stood beside him. Thinking about Colorado, she said. Thinking about all of it, he said. Where it started, where it is. He looked at the property with the survey eye she'd come to love. Nothing missed, everything valued. When I came down off that mountain, I believed my life was probably over in the ways that mattered. That I'd had my chance at something real, and I'd failed it, and the rest was just duration. She was quiet, listening. I was wrong, he said. Yes, she said. You were. He turned to look at her. My life started in that boarding house, when a woman knocked on a closed door and said she wasn't a visitor. He held her gaze. Everything before that was preparation. Everything after it is the actual thing. She felt that so completely, she had to look away for a moment. Not because she couldn't hold it, but because she wanted to hold all of it, the full weight of it, and she needed a second to make enough room. She looked at the North Ridge, the sound barn, the east fence, the life they'd built in 10 months from nothing but stubbornness and competence, and the particular grace of two people who refused to be only what the world had decided they were. Then she looked back at him. Ready for Colorado, she said. With you, he said. Ready for anything. Or, she took his arm, and they walked in from the fence together as the last March light left the sky, and behind them, the property settled into its evening quiet. The property that had been failing and was now thriving, that had been a joke, and had become a life that had been one woman's survival, and was now two people's home. The town of Willow Falls would talk about Clara and Eli Rourke for a long time. They would tell the story in the way communities tell the stories that teach them things about themselves imperfectly, with selective memory, with the comfortable revisionism of people who prefer to have been wiser than they were. They would say they always knew. They would say it was clear from the beginning. But the truth was simpler and harder than any version they would tell. A woman had walked into a boarding house and knocked on a closed door. A man had opened it. And two people, the world had written off, had looked at each other across a narrow room and recognized something they hadn't expected to find. Not romance, not rescue, but the rarer and more lasting thing, someone who would stay. Someone who would stay when the barn caught fire, when the lien came due, when the court date arrived and the money was short and the night was long. Someone who would knock anyway, even when they didn't know what was on the other side. That was what Clara Whitfield had done. That was what Eli Rourke had answered. And everything else, the property, the restored land, the Colorado acres, the life they were building and would keep on building, was the consequence of those two simple, complete, irreversible acts. A knock, an open door, and two people who finally, after all of it, had come home.